The medical board's findings were 3 pages long, and Admiral James Koret read all 3 of them, standing up, in the manner of a man who considers sitting down an act of trust he had not yet decided to extend to the document in front of him. When he finished, he set them on the table, pressed the heel of his hand flat against the paper, and looked across the room at Lieutenant Commander Koret. "You have 40% hearing loss in your left ear," he said. "Yes, sir," she said. "Progressive." "Yes, sir. And you want me to clear you to return to carrier operations." She was standing at ease, which in her case meant the particular stillness of someone who had stood in front of more than one authority figure with an unfavorable file and had learned, over time, that stillness was the first thing they looked for, the first thing they measured you against before they decided whether to listen. Before we continue, please comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the She Force Tales channel. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style. Her flight suit, which she was wearing not as a performance, but because she had come directly from the simulator, still smelled faintly of the recycled air that the training facility pumped into the cockpit to make it feel real. "I want you to look at my record, sir," she said. "Not just the medical file." "I've seen your record," Koret said. "I know you have, sir. I'd like you to look at it again." Something crossed the Admiral's face. Not irritation, exactly, but the specific expression of a man who has already made a decision and is being asked to unmake it, which is a different thing. He looked at the medical board's findings, then at her. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, "you are a talented aviator. Your fitness reports reflect that consistently. But carrier operations at night, in contested airspace, in the conditions this wing will be operating in, the margin for sensory error is not something I have the authority to compromise on, regardless of your record. The hearing loss is documented, it's progressive, and it presents a risk I cannot clear. With respect, sir," she said, "the hearing loss was documented 18 months ago. My simulator scores, since then, are in the top 3% of the air wing. My carrier qualification recertification, which I completed 6 weeks ago, is not the same as combat operations." "No, sir," she said, "it isn't." She reached into the folder she was carrying and set a single page on the table beside the medical board findings. She did not say anything about it. She simply placed it there and waited. Koret looked at the page. He looked at it for longer than he'd looked at most single pages in a career full of significant documents. What he was looking at was a flight incident report from 3 years earlier, filed with a classification level that should not have been accessible to anyone at this briefing, from a night he had heard about in the vaguest terms through the kind of informal channels that passed information when official one stayed quiet. He had never seen the full report. He had not known, until this moment, that it contained the specific numbers he was now reading. He looked up at her. "This is classified," he said. "Yes, sir," she said. "I had it declassified this morning. For this meeting." He looked back at the page. "You landed a single-engine F/A-18 Hornet," he said slowly, "at night, in 30-knot crosswind conditions, with primary hydraulics failed, on a carrier that was pitching 4 degrees in a force 7C state dash. 4.3 degrees, sir. The deck logs are attached. With 40% hearing loss in your left ear. I had 31% at the time of the incident, sir. It's progressed since." Admiral Koret set the page down very carefully, in the manner of someone setting down something they have just realized is heavier than they thought. "Nobody told me this was you," he said. "Nobody knew it was me, sir," she said. "I asked for my name to be kept out of the initial report. I didn't want the landing to be the story. I wanted to get back in the aircraft." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in the careful architecture of his certainty, built over 38 years of command and the specific, reasonable conviction that a progressive hearing impairment was a non-negotiable safety risk, began, very quietly, to develop a crack. Koret had wanted to fly since the age of 7, which was the year her father had taken her to an airshow outside Pensacola, and she had watched an F/A-18 Hornet perform a vertical climb at roughly 90 degrees off the deck and felt something happen in her chest that she would spend the rest of her life failing to fully describe to anyone who hadn't already experienced a version of it themselves. Her father had been a Navy man, 22 years, chief petty officer, never flew anything himself. He was sonar, which was its own kind of listening, its own particular relationship with the invisible. He had watched her watch the aircraft with the expression of a man who recognizes something in his child that is going to cost him sleep for the next decade, but has already decided to support it absolutely, because that was the kind of father he was. She had told him at 7 that she was going to fly one of those. He had said, "I know," not encouragingly, not as the dismissive affirmation that adults gave children who said grand things. As a statement of fact, the way he said most things, flatly, precisely, in the manner of a man who had spent 2 decades trusting instruments. She had been the kind of child who made lists, not of things she wanted, but of things she needed to do, ordered sequential, the list of someone mapping a route rather than making wishes. She had identified, by age 11, the academic requirements for a Naval Academy appointment. She had identified, by 13, the fitness benchmarks, the vision requirements, the academic focus areas that would give her the strongest application. She had been in the particular way that some very motivated young people are, not driven in the frantic, anxious sense, but simply organized, moving steadily toward a point she had already fixed in her mind with the calm certainty of someone following a known bearing. She had entered the Naval Academy at 18 and graduated 4 years later in the top 12% of her class. She had earned her wings of gold at 23, the day her father drove 6 hours from Pensacola to Meridian, Mississippi, to watch her receive them, and shook her hand in the manner of someone who had always been proud and had never felt the need to be demonstrative about it, until this particular moment made demonstration necessary. She had reported to her first fleet squadron at 24. By 27, she was a section lead. By 29, a division lead. Her fitness reports used words like exceptional situational awareness and superior instrument scan, and, in one memorable instance from a commanding officer who was normally economical with superlatives, the finest night systems operator I have observed in 12 years of fleet aviation. She had deployed twice to the Western Pacific, once to the Persian Gulf, and once to the Mediterranean during a period of elevated operational tempo that had required sustained night operations in airspace with a degraded communications environment, exactly the conditions, in other words, that were the most technically demanding, the most reliant on clean sensory input, the most unforgiving of any gap between a pilot's capability and the conditions surrounding them. She had thrived in those conditions. The hearing loss had begun, as hearing loss in aviators sometimes does, gradually and quietly, which was almost funny given that the mechanism of loss was precisely the opposite of quiet, decades of high-decibel cockpit environment. Engine noise, the percussive crack of catapult launches and arrested landings, accumulated into a slow, progressive erosion of the specific frequencies that mattered most. She had first noticed it 2.5 years ago, not in the cockpit, but in a restaurant, when she had found herself reading the lips of the person across from her without realizing she was doing it. She had scheduled the hearing assessment 6 weeks later. She had sat very still while the audiologist read her the results, in the particular stillness of someone who has just received information that requires recalculation. She had not told anyone in her chain of command immediately. She had spent 3 weeks running her own informal assessment, flying every evolution she could schedule, paying close attention to her own performance data, comparing her scan times and error rates and communication lag in the cockpit against her own baseline from the preceding year. She had found no degradation. Nothing in the numbers suggested the hearing loss had touched her performance at all. She had then told her flight surgeon, who had told her commanding officer, who had entered it in her medical file, which had worked its way up the chain with the efficiency of bad news in bureaucratic systems, until it reached Admiral James Koret's desk, where it had become the basis for the medical board findings that had brought her here, to this room, on this morning. The incident report she had placed on the table had not been part of any of that. It had been, until this morning, known to fewer than a dozen people. The night of the incident had begun, as many significant nights begin, with something going wrong. The deployment was 3 months in. The carrier, USS Ronald Reagan, was operating in the Philippine Sea in weather that the meteorology team had underestimated by a factor that the ship's weather officer would spend considerable energy explaining in the days that followed, the gist of which was that the storm system had developed faster and moved differently than any of the models had predicted, and by the time the discrepancy was fully apparent, 2 aircraft were already airborne and an hour into their training evolution. Dana Voss was in the lead aircraft. Her wingman, a lieutenant named Okafor, who was on his second deployment and was regarded by everyone in the squadron as one of the more capable young aviators in the air wing, was flying approximately 200 feet off her right wing at Angels 8 when the weather deteriorated from manageable with care to actively hostile in the span of about 12 minutes. They turned back toward the carrier immediately. The weather controller on the ship was already working the problem, vectoring them on a recovery heading that would keep them out of the worst of the developing cell, while positioning them for an instrument approach to the deck. It was a complicated evolution under any circumstances. At night, in deteriorating weather, with a sea state that was already 3 and was climbing, it was the kind of thing that the Navy trained for relentlessly and still filed in the category of difficult. Voss's hydraulics failed at 2:20 local time. The failure was not catastrophic in the sense of immediate loss of control. The Hornet's backup hydraulic system bought her time, as it was designed to do. But it was catastrophic in the sense that landing an aircraft with failed primary hydraulics on a moving ship in a 4-7 sea state at night was an operation that existed in the narrow gap between theoretically possible and not recommended under any circumstances, a gap whose precise width depended on a set of variables: pilot capability, aircraft state, deck conditions, wind, visibility, that were, on this particular night, stacked against her in almost every category simultaneously. The carrier's air boss had immediately begun clearing the deck of all personnel not essential to the recovery. The ship's captain had turned into the wind, accepting the storm heading rather than the optimal recovery heading, because the optimal recovery heading didn't matter if the aircraft couldn't get aboard. The squadron commanding officer was in the tower. The air wing commander was in the tower. 2 duty officers, 3 landing signal officers, and the ship's executive officer were also in the tower or on the platforms, because a crippled aircraft night recovery in 4-7 seas in the middle of a developing storm was exactly the kind of event that pulled command personnel out of their racks and into the spaces where they could watch and be useless together. In the aircraft, Dana Voss was not watching any of this. She was flying. The communication environment, as the storm developed and the electromagnetic clutter increased, had become degraded in ways that compounded the already significant technical problem of the hydraulic failure. Her ability to hear, already reduced by the documented 31% on her left side, was further compromised by the static interference pattern that the storm system was generating across the communications frequencies. What she was receiving from the ship's controllers and from her LSOs on the platform was partial, not complete, not the clean, full audio environment that every checklist and every procedure and every training evolution assumed would be available. She was, in practical terms, flying a crippled aircraft in a storm at night onto a pitching ship while hearing less than she would have heard with 2 functional ears and a clear sky. Nobody in the tower knew this. Nobody on the platform knew this. She had not told them, because telling them would have consumed radio time she did not have and would not have changed what she needed to do, which was get the aircraft on the deck. She flew it by the numbers she could still access: the attitude reference system, the airspeed, the vertical velocity, the angle of attack indexer on the heads-up display, which did not require her to hear anything to tell her whether she was high or low on glide path. She had built, over 7 years of carrier operations, an instrument scan so deeply habituated that it ran beneath conscious thought, the regular, rhythmic sweep of the displays that her eyes performed without being told, processing the data into a continuous picture of where the aircraft was and where it needed to go. What she could not fully hear, she saw. What she could not see, she flew. The LSO's radio calls were partial, and she interpreted the parts she received in context, not guessing, but reasoning the way you reason from incomplete evidence when you have enough other evidence that the gaps can be filled with high-confidence inference. A partial transmission that she heard as power dash, in combination with a rate of descent that was already telling her she was slightly high meant add power, and she added power before the full transmission reached her. A partial wave-off dash that she received in full became unnecessary half a second after she received it, because she had already seen the deck pitch and corrected, and the aircraft was on the right parameters without it. She crossed the threshold at exactly the correct speed, on exactly the correct glide path, with her right engine dead, and her primary hydraulics failed, and 30 knots of crosswind, and a deck that was pitching 4.3 degrees in a sea state that had no business hosting a night recovery, and she caught the 3-wire. The landing signal officers, who had been prepared to wave her off 3 separate times, and had not done so, because each time they reached for the wave-off paddle the aircraft had already corrected, stood on the platform for a moment in the wind and the rain and the motion of the ship without saying anything. The air boss from the tower called it the finest arrested landing I have witnessed in 22 years in naval aviation. He said this to the ship's captain, not over the radio, because he was not entirely sure in that moment that his voice would be reliable over the radio, and he was a man who had opinions about how certain things should sound when they were said. Voss taxied clear, was stopped by the deck crew, and sat in the cockpit for approximately 90 seconds before climbing down. She was asked by the first person to reach the aircraft whether she was all right. "Yes," she said. "How's Okafor?" Okafor had gotten aboard on his first pass 7 minutes earlier, while Voss was still working the hydraulic problem at altitude. He was fine. "Good," she said, and she walked to the debrief. She had asked for her name to be kept out of the initial incident report because she had known, with the specific foresight of someone who had been in the Navy long enough to understand how stories propagated, exactly what would happen if it wasn't. The landing would become the story. It would become an object of attention and examination and admiration and argument. And in the middle of all of that, what she needed, which was to get back into the aircraft quickly, without the weight of a famous landing on her back, would become considerably harder to arrange. What she had not fully anticipated was that the deliberate anonymization of the report, combined with the subsequent emergence of her hearing loss into the official record, would produce the specific situation she now found herself in. An admiral with an incomplete picture making a decision based on a medical file, in a room that did not yet contain the full story. She had spent 6 weeks deciding whether to declassify the report and bring it to this meeting. She had spent most of that time not on the question of whether the landing itself was relevant. It obviously was, but on the question of what it meant to use it, whether it was the right kind of argument, whether she was asking Admiral Koret to make a decision based on an extraordinary event rather than her sustainable baseline capability, which was a different thing and a less honest one. She had concluded, after 6 weeks, that the distinction didn't hold. The landing was not separate from her capability. It was her capability expressed under conditions of maximum stress, with maximum sensory impairment, in the specific environment where the Admiral was claiming she could no longer be trusted to operate. It was not an argument for special treatment. It was an argument against wrong information. She had declassified the report at 7:30 that morning and walked into the Admiral's office at 8 o'clock. The silence after Koret set the page down lasted approximately 30 seconds, which, in a room containing an admiral and a declassified incident report, felt considerably longer. "You told no one," he said finally, not accusingly, as a piece of information he was integrating. "My LSOs knew the deck was pitching," she said. "My air boss knew the hydraulics were failed. Nobody knew what I was hearing. It wasn't relevant to the recovery. It was relevant to the recovery afterward. It's relevant to this conversation." "Yes, sir. That's why I brought it." He picked up the page again, not to reread it, but to hold it, the way you hold something you're still deciding the weight of. "The 4.3-degree pitch," he said. "The published limit for night recovery is -3 degrees, sir. Discretionary waiver to 3.5 in emergencies. You were above the discretionary limit." "Yes, sir. So was the deck." He looked at her. Something in the architecture of his expression, the specific arrangement of the muscles around a senior officer's eyes when he is deciding whether he has been wrong, was shifting in a direction she had been hoping for but had not relied on. "Tell me about the instrument scan," he said, during the approach. "What were you using that you wouldn't normally use as primary reference?" She told him. She walked him through it with the precision of someone who had debriefed the approach many times in her own head, even if she hadn't debriefed it with anyone else. The specific sequence of display references, the inference process on the partial radio calls, the way the angle of attack indexer had anchored the glide path when the visual cues from the ship were intermittently obscured by rain and the deck's motion. She spoke for 11 minutes without notes. He did not interrupt her. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You flew the glide path on the AOA indexer, he said. Primarily, sir, with cross-reference to the radar altimeter in the final few seconds. In 30-knot crosswind. Crab it into it, sir. Standard crosswind technique. Adjusted for the hydraulic limitation on roll authority. With one engine. Right engine, sir. Left was operative throughout. He set the page down again. He looked at the medical board's 3 pages, which were still where he had left them, still saying what they said, still being accurate in every factual detail they contained. The medical board's findings are not wrong, he said. No, sir, she said. They're not. You do have progressive hearing loss. The risk is real. Yes, sir. The risk is real. The question is whether the risk is disqualifying given my actual performance data, or whether it's disqualifying based on an assumption about what the hearing loss prevents me from doing that my record, including the incident you just read, doesn't support. He was quiet again. Outside the office window, the carrier deck was visible, the flight deck of USS Ronald Reagan, laid out in the afternoon light, with 2 aircraft spotted forward of the island and a deck crew in yellow shirts moving in the purposeful, choreographed flow of people who had been doing this long enough that the choreography was invisible. What's your simulator ranking this quarter? He said. 3rd in the air wing, sir. I can pull the data if you need it. I know the data, he said. I checked it this morning before you came in. She looked at him. Something adjusted in her understanding of the conversation. A small recalibration. You checked my simulator data before this meeting, she said. I checked the data on every pilot who comes before medical review, he said. It's not unusual. No, sir, she said. But you led with the medical board's findings. He looked at her with an expression that might, in a man less disciplined, have been the beginning of a smile. I want to see how you made the argument, he said. She processed this for a moment. You already knew about the landing, she said. He said nothing, which was, she understood, its own kind of answer. The classification on that report, she said. You have access to it. I have access to most things, Lieutenant Commander, he said. That's one of the less useful aspects of this rank. The things I don't know tend to be the things that matter most, because they're exactly the things that don't reach me through official channels. He paused. I knew there had been an extraordinary recovery on that deployment. I did not know it was you. I requested the pilot's name 6 weeks ago. The request was still working through the declassification review when you filed your own declassification request this morning and saved the process 3 weeks. She looked at him steadily. And the medical board? Is the medical board's correct finding based on the information in your file, he said, which did not include the incident report, which now does. He set both documents, the 3 medical pages and her single incident page, flat on the table beside each other, with the deliberateness of someone arranging 2 things that needed to be considered together. I'm going to ask the board to reconvene with the full record. I am also going to request an independent aviation medicine evaluation focused specifically on your demonstrated performance under the conditions of auditory limitation, not a theoretical assessment of risk, but an evidence-based evaluation of what the record shows you can do. That could take weeks, she said. Yes, he said. It will take the time it takes. I'm not going to put you back in a cockpit on a waiver I haven't properly supported, and I'm not going to keep you out of a cockpit on a finding that doesn't account for the full picture. Both of those would be wrong. He looked at her for a moment. You flew that approach on an AOA indexer and partial radio calls, he said, with 31% auditory loss, failed hydraulics, 1 engine, and a deck pitching past its own safety limit. Yes, sir. And your first question after you climbed down the aircraft was about your wingman. He was out there longer than he expected to be, she said. I put him in a holding pattern while I worked the hydraulic problem. That's not nothing in that weather. Koret looked at the deck outside his window for a moment, at the yellow shirts moving in their choreographed flow, at the aircraft spotted forward at the horizon line where the sea met the sky in the flat, clean way it met the sky on a good day. My first carrier landing was in fair weather, at noon, with both engines, full hydraulics, and a deck that was moving half a degree, he said. I bolted twice. She said nothing. I'm not saying that to be self-deprecating, he said. I'm saying it because I want you to understand that I know what a carrier landing costs in the best conditions, and I know what you spent on that approach, and I know those 2 things are not in the same category. He turned back from the window. The reevaluation will be thorough, and it will be fast, and I will personally review its findings before any decision is made. You have my word on that." "Thank you, sir," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Bring me data. Everything your flight surgeon has on the auditory compensation mechanisms you're using in the cockpit. Your full sim logs for the past 18 months. If you've been working adaptive techniques with the avionics, I want those documented." He paused. "I want the record to be complete. No more incident reports in someone's desk waiting to matter at the right moment." "Understood, sir." She picked up the folder she had come in with, which was now 1 page lighter than when she'd arrived. She came to attention. "Dismissed, Lieutenant Commander," Koret said. She turned for the door. She was 3 steps from it when he spoke again. "Voss." She turned. He was looking at the 2 documents still lying side by side on his desk. The medical board's 3 pages, the incident reports 1. "The air boss on that deployment," he said. "Retired now. He told me, at a dinner, that he'd seen a recovery that night that he didn't have language for. He said he'd watched a lot of good aviation in his career, and that landing was something else. He didn't know your name because you'd kept it out of the report." He said dash. The Admiral stopped, as if choosing the words carefully rather than just repeating them. He said it was the kind of flying that reminded him why this matters. Why we do this. He said that about a landing in a storm at night in the worst conditions he'd seen in 22 years. "I thought you should know someone said it." She stood with her hand on the doorframe. "Tell him thank you," she said. "When you see him." "I will," Koret said. She walked out into the passageway, which smelled of steel and paint and the faint, distant undertone of jet fuel that had become, over 7 years of carrier deployments, so familiar as to be nearly invisible. The smell of a place that felt, more than any other place she knew, like the specific location where she was exactly who she was supposed to be. She had a simulator brief in 40 minutes. She was going to be early for it. The independent aviation medicine evaluation took 3 weeks. Its conclusion, when it arrived, did not describe her auditory limitation as non-existent. It couldn't because it wasn't. What it described, in the precise language of the evidence it had been given, was a pilot who had developed, through documented practice and demonstrable result, a suite of compensatory techniques that sustained her performance under the specific sensory conditions her limitation created, techniques that were measurable, repeatable, and verified by an 18-month performance record that showed not a single degraded outcome attributable to the auditory deficit. The board reconvened. The full record was reviewed. The waivers were not simple. They never were in cases like hers, and she had known going in that simplicity was not something she was going to get out of this. What she had wanted, and what she now had, was precision. A specific, carefully bounded determination of what she could do and under what conditions, rather than the blunt instrument of a finding that treated all conditions as equivalent and all risk as undifferentiated. She was returned to flight status with conditions documented, monitored, and reviewed on a defined schedule. She was back in the aircraft 6 weeks after the evaluation concluded. Her first flight was a night familiarization hop, routine, low workload, designed to re-establish currency. The conditions were fair. The deck was calm. Both engines were operative. The landing, by all objective measures, was unremarkable. She taxied clear, climbed down, handed her helmet to the plane captain, and walked toward the island. And she was halfway there when she stopped and looked up at the sky, which was very dark and very clear at that altitude over that ocean, and the stars were the kind of visible they only got when you were away from any land that produced light. And she stood there for a moment with the wind coming off the bow and the smell of the deck and the sound of the next aircraft turning downwind. Somewhere above and behind her, she had her whole career left. She was 32 years old. She had more to do than she could count from here. She walked inside.